All right, now we've been talking about Omicron, where we're at just as far as COVID is concerned. Now, interestingly, late yesterday, Westpac saying it will provide employees and their families a booster shot as part of the government corporate vaccination program. This comes as the Fair Work Commission on mandatory vaccinations has found that BHP was not within its rights to implement a mandate on its workforce. Joydeep Hoare joining us now from People, Culture and Strategies to talk us through the implications. Joydeep, terrific to talk to you again. So there would be a lot of other companies in Australia at the moment looking at this and thinking, okay, what do we need to do? Because others have implemented a mandatory vaccination.
That's right. Good morning to both of you. When this decision was handed down late last week, there was immediate panic and consternation, I think, amongst certainly all organisations around the country that had introduced a mandatory vaccinations policy or something akin to it, because the headline, of course, was that BHP was found to have been unlawful in introducing mandatory vaccinations policy. While that was absolutely the finding, it certainly was not the case that the Fair Work Commission said that mandatory vaccination policies per se, in and of themselves, are unlawful. Far from it. In fact, what the Fair Work Commission did say, in some ways, was but for the technicality of a consultation obligation that it found that BHP was in breach of, the introduction of such a policy would have in fact been lawful and reasonable, or was highly likely to have been found to be lawful and reasonable. So it is important that employers understand that, as a general rule, there's certainly been no finding that mandatory vaccinations policies are unlawful or aren't reasonable. However, if you do have obligations, whether they're technical or otherwise, for example, under a policy that you yourself have introduced in your organisation that says prior to introducing any work health and safety measure, we're going to consult with our employees, we're going to consult with unions. And if you don't do what you say you're going to do, well, that might actually come back and bite you when it comes to the introduction of a policy. So employers, I think the main thing they should be doing is just checking that the issues that, unfortunately for BHP, brought them unstuck in this particular instance are not going to be applying to them in their situation.
I mean, comparing, contrasting, say, SBC with BHP, because I remember interviewing SBC. They're actually one of the vanguards of saying employee safety comes first, but they gave employees like 9 months to get vaccinated, whereas BHP pretty much sacked 30 workers on the spot. Is that the key difference between the two approaches?
Look, I think the decision of the full bench was very much around when an employer has an obligation to consult, what does that consultation look like? And you're quite right. In any kind of process of change management or change introduction for an organisation, such as the introduction of a vaccinations policy, the more time that you give your workforce or relevant people who you're going to be asking to comply with it, to get their head around it, to make the necessary inquiries. Consultation does not mean that you need their agreement or approval to do it, but it does mean that you give them a chance to provide input in relation to what you're proposing to do. You consider that input, and naturally, if you're going to be rushing anything through, it comes across as though you're just paying lip service to the consultation or you're just ticking a box. I think that's very much my sense of how the Fair Work Commission in this particular instance found BHP to have acted.
So, I mean, it is such a difficult subject to tackle for us as an employer and employees, of course. So, Joydeep, much like you're seeing in society at the moment, there is going to be a small proportion that are resistant to any vaccine mandate. As an employer, how do you handle that small proportion of the workforce? I mean, some could take the brutal path and say, you're out, you're not abiding by company culture. Is there another way around this?
Well, the choice as to what an employer does in respect of an employee who refuses to be vaccinated, and let's put to one side those employees who are validly and legally able to claim that they have a medical contraindicator. But you're quite right. There is a small proportion of most workforces, I would say, or at least half workforces that we're working with at the moment, who are refusing to be vaccinated. The question as to what the employer should do or can do, well, the can-do question is if you've introduced your policy, if you've given time, if you've made it clear that people are expected to comply with it and the relevant dates have passed and they haven't complied and they're not providing any indication that they are going to be complying with it, well, you do have the right, subject to following due process, to terminate that person's employment. As to whether that's the right thing to do, we're seeing a lot of employers who have arrived at this pointy end who are feeling really nervous about doing that. And they're not feeling nervous because of a legal uncertainty. They're feeling nervous about whether they're actually doing the right thing ethically. And having regard, as you say, Andrew, to that whole issue of societally, we know that there is controversy around this. We know that it's a polarizing issue. Yes, it is a small percentage of the working population that fall into that category of haven't been and probably won't be vaccinated. Employers are choosing in many instances to say to some of those individuals, we'll give you time. You won't be paid for that time, but we will allow you to stay on our books. And what that does for an employer is it keeps their options open. For example, if the landscape changes in 3 months and we find that need for vaccinations is not as critical as what we've been saying it is for the better part of this year, well, employers might choose to moderate or soften the policies and approaches that they've introduced. However, that may not change. And so I think employers shouldn't be guessing too much about what the future holds. I'm certainly not suggesting that employers should not be terminating employment of employees. Ultimately, when you introduce policies and you say that people are meant to comply with it, you should be serious about what you say you're going to do. However, it is a changing landscape and there's no right or wrong answer. Every employer's got to think about its values, what it stands for, obviously its legal obligations, and good luck. It's a difficult decision for organisations to have to make.